Hi, thank you for attending this session. It's called Just Like a Woman. I'm so pleased you're here and not at the polyamory chat, so strike one for us, yay. Today we have Anita Nair. She's recently written a book of short stories called Why I Killed My Husband. And we have Gayatri Prabhu, who's written a book called A Genre of Her Own. We were also meant to have Arundhati Subramaniam here today, but thank you, Indigo, she wasn't able to make it. I would love to start with you, Gayatri. You wrote a book that is, as I was telling you before, the introduction was terrifying because it was so academic. But then it is a series of profiles about Indian women writers who we've basically never heard of before. And I would like to know, first of all, why you decided to try excavate the lives of these women, because you can't Google them. ChatGPT is not going to give you a list of the women to follow. Why did you decide to do it, and how did you find the women?
Okay, thank you, Dia. I apologize for the terrifying part. Okay, so I don't know if I found them. I think they found me, thanks to many translations that have come out in the last decade in Bengali and from Marathi. But essentially, I'm a professor of literary studies. I teach in Manipal. I'm also a novelist and a poet and a memoirist. So I was teaching this course. Some of my students are here. Here, yes? Yes, hi. Okay. So I was teaching a course about like the emergence of modern prose, right? Sometime in the 19th century, we see genres like the novel, right, that is being read, and we are different languages, different authors are trying to recreate these novels, right? And so while I was teaching the course, part of my frustration was initially like, where are the women and what are they doing? And as you even read the literature, you see that they're mostly being treated. So, there's much credit to the historians. What would I do without them? But they're being seen as actors in the nationalist movement or part of the social reform movement. We know that the 19th century was about a whole string of legislations, right? Sati regulation or the Widow Remarriage Act. But I think my question was this, which is, who are my literary foremothers? Okay, and there is, of course, the education we've grown up with. So a genre of our own, those of you know, evokes Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. You know that, right? So I was thinking, who are my literary foremothers? And what will it mean to read them as writers, right? Not as representing any position on the whole, a conversation around social reform. Women should get educated. But these are women who are the first in their communities, in their families, writing something. And so what are they writing? More importantly, how are they writing? Right? So that's the starting point. Sorry, you had a question there.
Yeah, so tell me why you decided to pick those women, because if you haven't read the book, and you should, just skip the introduction, trust me.
Skip it.
Is that there's a deep dive into a woman who is entirely, and I think we call it an autodidact. She taught herself how to read and write through religious texts.
Okay, shall I just quickly go through the names?
Yes.
So, and that's one reason I'm here. I want to say these names. Okay, so they are, A Genre of Her Own is divided into 3 chapters and a conclusion. So the first chapter, actually there's a linguistic cluster. So the first chapter is the Marathi ladies, right? So we have the pamphleteer is Tarabai Shinde, who at a very young age wrote this extraordinary, I would say, a text of anger. I call it just anger, not just anger, but that which is for justice. It's called Stri Purush Tulna. Okay, she's the pamphleteer. She wrote one book and she never wrote again, which tells you something about the kind of backlash she faced. The letter writer is Anandibai Joshi, who at the age of 18 got into the medical school in Pennsylvania, was the first person to get a medical degree, first woman, but of course died by the time she was 21, right, before she took up her first job. So she's the letter writer. She's writing letters to her husband, and he, without her permission, is publishing it in the newspapers. Okay, so she's the letter writer. The third person is the essayist, Rakmabai. Rakmabai actually was also married as a child. When she came of age, she refused the restitution of conjugal rights. She refused to live with her husband because she said, he's no good for me. And then one of the judges said, you have to go to jail if you don't go live with him. And she said, I'd rather go to jail than live with this husband. So that's her. The second chapter has the memoirist, the dramatist, and the novelist. The memoirist is Rashundari Devi, and I will talk about her a little later. So Rashundari Devi wrote what is the first full-length life narrative in India. It took another 2 decades before a man wrote it. So she's that ahead of her times. But this is a woman who didn't go to school, had no books, met no writers, had no library. She writes the first book of life narrative. Okay, that's Rashundari Devi in rural Bengal, which is now Bangladesh, right? The dramatist is Binodini Dasi, Natti Binodini, working woman, right? She made her own money. She was on the stage. She was the star of her generation, right? People came from everywhere. Short-lived career, 11 to like 22, her career is over, right? But she commanded the respect of her times. So that is Binodini. And then the novelist is Swarna Kumari Devi Ghoshal. I don't like to say this, but I have to just to give a context. She's from the Jorasanko Tagore families. So she's an older sister of Rabindranath Tagore. Not his shining moment. I have some stories about him here, but she's the novelist. The last chapter is the elegist, the diarist, and the travelogue. So this is the Anglophone world. So the first cluster is the Marathi, second Bengali. The third is the Anglophone world, includes a Urdu writer. The elegist here is Kripabai Satyanathan, who wrote a book called Saguna, again untimely death. But Saguna is a large work. She's a fan of George Eliot. She loves Middlemarch. And so she's writing this extraordinary book about like death and suffering and almost like a contemporary discourse and language of mental health. So that's the elegist. The diarist is Atiya Faizi, who at the age of 19 gets a scholarship to go to London to be a teacher. And she's not able to finish her course. The unsaid narrative here is there is some mental health discourse which is not written about. But what I loved about Atiya at the age of 19, she's just madly taking notes. And then she's writing letters to her sisters, who then edit it. That's what sisters do. I have mine there who's photographing me. And actually then publishes it, they publish it in a journal for women that has a woman editor. So I think of it as this whole world of sisterhood. She's writing to her biological sisters and addresses Begum editor Sahiba, because her editor is a woman. And then she writes it for the Tehzeeb-e Behne, because Tehzeeb is that journal. So this whole discourse of sisterhood. The travelogue, who's the fun person here, because the travelogue is Dosebai Kovasji Jasawala. She wrote in English The Story of My Life. And she, at the age of 70, decided she wants to go around the world, is obsessed with meeting the King of England. She's probably the only woman of her generation who met the King of England and the Pope, right? And at some point got into a hot air balloon at the Paris exhibition and went up in her Parsi finery, right? So just fun, she's fun. And the conclusion, I go back to the beginnings. The very first full-length book of modern poetry we have, Savitribai Phule, also just a revolutionary educator, right? So I go back to her in the conclusion where at the age of 22, she writes her first collection, Kavya Phule. And so the end is called The Poet and the Chorus. And I look at a few other women. So I just had to say all their names out aloud. Thank you for being patient. Thank you.
I love the way you describe them as literary mothers. And they're such interesting women. Anita, I wanted to ask you, because the book that I read of yours is a book of short stories. The one about the woman killing her husband, it's such a fun read. It's very interesting, it's very good, but it's also very fun. I won't spoil the ending, but I really do want to ask Anita how she figured out how to kill the husband.
Right, okay, thank you everybody for coming here and for joining all of us. So, Why I Killed My Husband began its life as an audio story. And, it's one of those things. I mean, if you ask me why I wrote the story, I don't know. I mean, yes, I'm certainly
married?
like every wife. I've also had, visions of how to kill my husband without getting caught. But it's also about trying to understand what drives a woman to that last step. So it is funny, it is, ironic. And it makes you, and the heroine is somebody who's very, very kind of matter of fact about it. You know, she doesn't sound like she's, you know, feeling guilty or remorseful or anything. She's very cold about it, and she talks about it in a very, I would think, in a very chatty manner, you know, like telling people about what drove her to it. And, excuse me, the refrain that I've used, and which is the title, and which is why the title kind of suggested itself, was the first line is, "I should have killed my husband on our wedding day." You know, so it begins there. And then it goes on, and she takes you through her life as a middle class woman living in Chennai. She is, you know, she's got a job she works in a bank, and her husband had a job in the Life Insurance Corporation of India. So typically middle class, tam-bram household in Chennai. And this is the last person you would think of as someone who's been kind of considering murder. And she goes about it in a very, I think, thorough fashion. And I think the greatest part of writing this book for me, the greatest joy, was actually all researching it and looking up all the various ways that one could do it. And then realize, and I remember, you know, actually when I started writing this, I'd spoken to somebody who is a very well-known forensic scientist, and I called him up, and he's this very elderly gentleman, so I had to kind of very gently he said, "Tell me the story," and then I was like, okay, so this is this wife. And I could see his like eyebrows reaching his forehead, because he was like, why am I asking these questions, and so on. And so I had to talk to a lot of people. I had to kind of do all these things before I could get the fun into writing it.
Your algorithm must be wild. That was obviously the first story of the book, and then your book sort of goes through like these different thematic issues that touch on life in India, and there's like you've gone north to the Punjab, and obviously you've gone south as well. I want to ask you though about your last story, because for me, I think the stories that spoke to me the most were the beginning and the end. I did read all of them. Yeah. I was so why don't you explain the story a bit, because I was so taken into it, I didn't realize that I was being fooled myself. Okay. Yeah.
So I'm sure all of you here have heard about this wonderful phenomenon that has been part of our lives, the digital arrest that happens, how the scams that, you know, when people call you and stuff like that, and then they tell you all kinds of things. So April 2024, I got scammed. Royally is what I would say. I got scammed. And it completely left me shattered, because it was about, I mean, I was fortunate that I, you know, didn't kind of lose all my savings and everything. I was able to kind of figure it out at one point. But what intrigued me more than anything else was how somebody, I consider myself a fairly, you know, well-read person, a person who knows what's going on, but how somebody even like me, who should have been able to spot the first red flag, like in the first, you know, 30 seconds of our conversation, didn't. And how I kind of, you know, was inveigled into it, and the whole thing that happened. And after I came out of it, the first thing I told myself is, I'm going to write about this. I need to write about this, to put this to bed in my own mind, because, you know, otherwise it's a sense of being violated all the time, that someone made an ass of you and did it so effortlessly, and how easily I allowed myself to be fooled. So I wanted to write about that, taking a lot of things that had happened to me during the course of these conversations I had with various supposedly high-ranking police officials and so on. So I think it's also a bit about this sense of fear that all of us live with in a democracy. It doesn't have to be a totalitarian government, but even in a democracy, back of your mind, you think that even within a democratic setup, there are so many instances where people are accused of crimes that they haven't committed, and they land up in jail and they rot there for a long time. And so back of your mind, you're wondering, what if this is going to be my life? So you're willing to give that person who's kind of, talking to you and telling you how to get yourself out of this situation, you're willing to give them that time and willing to kind of listen to them. And that's pretty much what happened to me. And so I wanted to write about it. And so that's the most contemporary story that I've written because it's set in 2024.
It was heart-stopping. And I'm just wondering, your book sort of delved into the lives of very, very different people. So we have Tambram housewife, we have a young Dalit woman who's studying medicine, we have a Punjabi farmer. And I am very curious to know how you center yourself in these stories, right? Because we all come from somewhere and we see the world in a particular way. How did you shift that to allow yourself to write from the point of view of a man?
I think for me, one of the greatest joys of writing is to be able to kind of shed my own self and become my character. While I'm writing a particular character, at that point of time, I'm not saying it lives with me 24 hours through the day, but it does live with me in some form or the other. And so that I become that character in my mind. So whether I'm writing about a young Dalit woman, or I'm writing about a farmer in Uttar Pradesh, or whether I'm writing about a middle-aged man in Kerala, it doesn't matter to me. Or I'm writing about this woman living in Bangalore who's scammed. I have to locate myself as a person within my character. And then I start looking at experiences of my own, which in some way allows me to kind of make that transformation complete. So that is what I've tried to do when with every character that I create, that I have to enter the persona of that character, shed my own self and be that. It's not easy. It takes a lot of hard work in terms of, what it does to you emotionally and mentally. But I think ultimately that's what makes it this absolutely mind-blowing experience for a writer.
Right. That story you wrote about the middle-aged man from Kerala, it reminded me of your first story about the middle-class Tambram woman, in the sense of people who only just wanted to be very ordinary and have nothing happen to them. And it was so interesting, to write into that. Writing around absence is so much harder than writing about something, and you pulled that off so well in those two stories. Gayatri, I wanted to come back to you. It was something we were discussing before, which was you must have had a lot of material to start off with, right? And everything has to be winnowed down to your finalists. How did you decide on the women you were going to profile in your book?
And I'm just listening to what Anita said and how she sheds herself to find these characters. And I was thinking, actually, in my writing process, it's probably the other way around. When I'm writing other characters, other people, I find myself burrowing even deeper and deeper into myself. And so the organizing principle for me, and this I noticed actually in many literatures, not just in the Indian context, that from the first appearance of women in the print culture, in sort of public space, is very often through life narratives. Right? So through their own, bearing testimony, drawing from their own life. So I started to sort of see the pattern, and there are many women who get mentioned, but like you said, I can't do the deep, sort of the close reading, which is the methodology I've been following. Maybe somewhere I just sort of, I was joining dots. This is something we were talking about earlier, right? You listen to a lot of stories, a lot of life narratives, and it was almost like following the breadcrumbs in the forest, right? There were patterns that were emerging. They were beautiful to me. I was hoping that some of that, and here I'm trying to combine like my academic self, which is because I want also this to speak to the existing discourse and scholarship, but at the same time to have these lives maybe speak to each other, not just to me. So for example, I'll give you an example. Like I'm interested in mental health, advocacy or mental health discourse. And so you can see across these women, across these texts, all of these first start to appear. Rashundari is an outlier, and so is Savitribai Phule. But from 1880s to 1920s, that's the time period that you see more and more of these narratives emerge. I start to notice, for example, that maybe there is a writer who is writing about, like Binodini. She calls herself Janma Dukkhini. This is my Bedona Gatha, like, pardon my Bengali, but like she talks about it in a certain rhetoric, but the subtext is very much something else. You have to read against the grain, right? And so maybe somebody else, like maybe Dosebai, is just talking about going around the world, but half her life she's either not talking to her mother or not talking to her brother or not talking to her daughter, and there is an intergenerational pain that is. So what I'm saying is that it comes in different molds, right? And part of the satisfaction for me was to read against it. Those were the dots that were joining. Sometimes to do with marriage, sometimes to do with motherhood, sometimes to do with sexuality, livelihood, caretaking. Like it feels like there's an affective register, right? That we look for.
I'm always curious about what makes it in, because I know that what we leave on the cutting floor is we leave a lot behind to like focus on certain things. You're not allowed to have a favorite, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
I know you. Yeah, because this morning I was looking at the book and I spotted a character who just has 2 pages, and I was like, I have to write about her. But you did ask me to think of a favorite, and I feel like if I pick one, I'm betraying the others. But you pointed out somebody who stood out for you. So I think I'll take your favorite.
Oh my goodness.
No?
I mean...
Okay, let's talk about Rashundari.
No, because
right?
I'm crazy about the Bengali actress.
Are you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it wasn't just having to write. I mean, it wasn't just that she was writing. She had to write against people's stereotypes of who she was. You know, she tried to rewrite herself through literature. I found that stunning. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true actually. Yeah, hard to pick, but maybe because I mentioned Rashundari earlier, and I'll connect her to Binodini, so these are the dots joining. So recently I was asked, okay, maybe that's why it's on my mind. I was asked to speak to a conclave of school principals, and I asked to talk about technology and how the youngsters are reading these days. And I ended up telling them a story from the 19th century, right, about Rashundari. And they were like, why is she going there? And I said, because you think about it, how does somebody become literate if they have no access to books or school or teachers or other writers? How do they do it? There's a way in which there's a self-teaching that happens, right? There's a way in which she is recalling sounds from her childhood. Okay, so this is someone who's married at 11, has 12 children, does caretaking for a blind mother-in-law, and cooks all meals for a household of 24 people. Okay, and through all of this, there are days when she doesn't have time to eat. But she's just driven by this hunger to read and write. So maybe something about her desperation there in rural Bengal touched me deep, right? So she would recall sounds she heard in her childhood. Then she took a palm leaf from her son when her son was not looking. She stole her son's palm leaf. Then she sits in the kitchen and tactile, like, you know, she traces the alphabets, matches the shape of letters to sound she's heard, right? And teaches herself to read. Remember, this is the generation they were told that if they read and write, then they'll become widows, which at that time was considered a fate worse than death, right? So it's around 1868 that she finally, the year her husband dies, she writes her book, right? There's a connection there.
Thank you. And
This is my dark humor in class. Okay. But so maybe that. And Binodini, just to connect, because you did say that, I felt like of all of them, she stood out for me because unapologetic about making money. And this is when the female roles on stage were played by what were called female impersonators. Like men played female roles, right? Women did not go on stage. If you appeared on stage, if you're under the lights, you were considered quote unquote right? A prostitute, right? You were considered somebody who's not respectable. And then there is Binodini, right? Who she played against Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and people would come from everywhere, including Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, right? Vivekananda. People went to see her, and on stage, she was the role, right? So and she would watching Shakespeare plays, right?
Amazing.
And so I can see why you also connect with her, because I think she's the one person who said, I'm going to be unapologetic about making money and being a star, right? Yeah.
Before I flip to you, Anita, I have one last question for Gayatri, which was about Tagore's sister. If you guys have read the book Wifedom by Anna Funder, it does the remarkable job of tipping George Orwell on his head, because she really, as much as we love George Orwell, she exposes the misogynist within, and also the lack of credit, and the secret writing and the secret editing, the stuff that was always invisible, done by his wife. I was wondering after reading you whether Tagore is should be in line for a bit of an examination of his backstory, because that churlish letter to his mate about please ignore my sister, she's embarrassing me, was really something.
Yes. Okay, not his shining moment, like I said. So this is his older sister. And if the Jorasanko Tagores had so many writers in the family, they could bring out a literary magazine every month with in-house writers. And Bharati was the journal. And Swarnakumari Devi Ghoshal was the editor for the longest time. So she's older than him. She has written longer than him, right? And she's written novels. So Kahake is her novel. So this is around the time, turn of the century, right? Late 1800s, 1900. You have Tagore is now emerging, is much feted. Very quickly, by 1913, he's written Gitanjali, he's won the Nobel Prize for Literature. In the same family, you have someone who's been writing longer, okay? She has to translate her own book into English. She's trying very hard to get it published in London, right? And tries to spend her own money to get it published. And there is a letter which is very scathing, and like I said, doesn't show Tagore in good light, where he writes to the publisher that he knows she's going to reach out to say, do not entertain my sister, do not publish her. It's a very, like I said, truly churlish is a good word. It's not a generous letter at all. Who knows, sibling rivalry or... But on the other hand, you also have this idea of what is literature. So just to put just very quickly, right, she's writing... what are Victorian novels at this time, right? They're about courtship, right? So there's a part of her that's trying to recreate that. At a time when women didn't have choice about who they're going to marry or romance, she's trying to recreate it. Of course, she has the Brahma Samaj context, right? Where there was access to education, there was some agentiality, some choice. So there's a way in which, this is the other reason why I wanted to write this book. I came here to talk about it, is because there was a way in which it was dismissed. This is domestic literature, right? Aduge maine sahitya, right? Kitchen literature, so to say. Or this is romance, this is melodrama, right? But this is life too, and these are stories, these are important stories that have to be told. So I think there's a little bit of dismissiveness, a little bit of patronizing, quite a bit of patronizing.
I think all good heroes should be slain.
So that there is that, and I kept that letter in here because I'm sorry to say that even contemporary scholars who read, they haven't read Swarnakumari Devi. They read Tagore. They read this letter by Tagore, and believe it or not, I've seen even contemporary scholars just repeat what he says. The sister didn't have much literary merit. They repeat that. So I felt, no, we have to put that letter out and say, maybe he was wrong, right? And actually, she's a fabulous storyteller. I recommend her. Read her.
Thank you. I can't wait for the takedown. Anita, your introduction when you wrote the book on Why I Killed My Husband was about, you'd been sort of set the task of talking about social issues and then sort of weaving them into short stories. I'm really curious about how you decided to write what you wrote, because these stories do just exist on their own. Like, you know, they're whole and they're round and they have a beginning and an end, and if I didn't know there were social issues meant to run through them, I would have just enjoyed them also as stories. But tell me why you picked the things that you did.
Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to do with this specific book was actually try and create, I mean, there is this genre called State of the Nation stories, but I wanted to take it a little beyond just a political narrative and talk about how politics has a huge impact on personal lives. We don't really realize it, but there are so many things that happen which kind of skews the way we take decisions and which also probably influences it in a certain way. And one of the things that has struck me in some time now, in the past, let's say, decade or so, a couple of things. One, of course, is the tumultuousness that we have been witness to as a nation in terms of so many things that have happened. Everything has kind of almost reached its breaking point in the last 10 years. Whether it is the way we look at the people around us, how, secularism itself is now a word that no longer has great meaning at all, and in the way we live our lives and so on. So this was just one part of it, but there were so many other things that has happened in the last 10 years. Let's take, for instance, the demonetization, or we've had something called the CAA Act and stuff like that. The reservation quotas continue, and all of these things have been happening, and all of these things are meant to do something towards nation building. The sad part, of course, is that not always does it result in nation building, and it leads to other things that make people, do things that they wouldn't have done otherwise. And overlying all this is that the general population of the country has this great apathy towards everything that's unfurling around us. And I wanted to talk about all of this in this particular book. So I thought one of the best ways of doing it is, instead of writing a work of nonfiction, I would rather use stories to talk about these things. Whether it's as something as, like going and doing a nota while you're voting, or why would you think that demonetization could affect a particular family? Or why does the reservation quota come with a lot of questions in terms of, like, there are children who enter a medical college, for instance, and they get in there because of a certain reservation allowed to them. But once they are there, it doesn't end there. Then they are subject to a lot of brutality, emotional brutality, and nobody's talking about these things. So I have always tried to kind of address issues that is around us all the time, but we don't pay too much attention to it because all of us are so busy with our own lives and our own business of living. So for me, stories are the best way of actually kind of steering attention towards what ails us as a society. Something that I tell my writing students as well is that, not all of us can go through every experience that we write about, but what we can do is dip into experiences that has been part of our lives in some way and use that to trigger anger, sorrow, guilt, whatever, any of the emotions that usually comes with a negative experience. So in this case, I have two stories here in this collection. One is called Kota Girls, and Kota Girls is about two young girls one girl is from Bangalore and another girl is from Tumkur, and they belong to the Dalit community. And they belong to a very specific caste, which kind of makes them, like, seriously, according to the Savarna system, untouchable. And because of which these children have to deal with a lot of rubbish right from day one that they go into school. And and because these girls are very, brilliant, they manage to get their, do the exams right and everything. And they get admission into a very prime, prestigious medical college. And once they are there, they actually come in with a lot of hope and expectations, believing that this is going to be the thing that is going to make them actually kind of break every impediment that has been there in their way and move on into better things. But then they kind of witness the bullying that happens because of caste politics. And having to deal with it, I mean, one way of dealing with it is to rebel, and the other way of dealing with it is trying to kind of make yourself invisible so that, you know, nobody points fingers at them and so on. So I wanted to talk about it, and for which I needed to start asking myself, like, you know, you come from a certain background, you come from a certain community, and these are things that don't really affect you. And I remember once, a long time ago, I think that's where the story began. I remembered, you know, my son and I were talking about caste, and I told him that, you know, I don't believe in caste and stuff like that. And he looked at me and he said, do you realize what a privileged position you are in to be able to say that? Because you've never had to deal with that, you know? I mean, deal with what are the horrific parts of the caste system. And that kind of stayed in my mind for a while, and you know, it stayed and stayed, and then I wanted to write about this. And then as a writer, I start looking at my own personal experiences. So I may not have been subject to any of the experiences my characters do, but I was just telling Dia that, you know, for instance, Indians, when we carrying an Indian passport, and we are at the border control of some European country or, you know, white nation, the scrutiny that you're subject to is pretty much like the way that, you know, probably once upon a time, Dalits were scrutinized when they had to enter a temple. You know, to check, are you really legit? Should you be going in? And all of those things. And every time that happens to me, I get really angry back of my mind. I'm thinking I'm only here because I have something to do. I really do not want to live in your country. I'm very happy living in mine. And this is something that now I would kind of dredge into this feeling that I have and try and work that into probably a scene where I'm able to use that emotion to create whatever I need to at that point.
No, thank you for that, because I was very curious. I'm sorry, I again have forgotten to open it to questions, and we're down to 2 minutes. So if anyone has questions, please jump in now. Yes.
Hi Gayatri, hi Anita. Really glad to see you guys here, and congratulations on your books. My question is to Gayatri. First of all, congratulations on such a powerful book about feminist literature that inspires all women who are, you know, who look into get into writing. My question to you is that, you know, you're trying to talk about a time and bring into light writers or authors who were probably ignored at a time where feminism was not in light as much. And we have seen developments, but along with the exponential increase with feminism as a movement, there are also creators out there, for the better lack of words, who express negative emotions towards these movements. And they have a parallel movement which, you know, advocates for women going back to like home and cooking. So how does that make you feel that in a time where we should be moving forward, we are kind of moving backward also?
2025, Trad Wives, discuss.
I was actually going for that. I just didn't want to say it out loud.
Well, thank you for being here, and thank you for your question. I think, part of my work is historical, right? But I'm going back to this time, and I'm making a case for a feminist literary genealogy. That is mainly the project. But I'm also very aware that that's not a word or a term or a sentiment or a movement any of these women might claim, but they claim it in their own way. So I think for me, what is important is what is being claimed. How is it being claimed, right? Does it have to be a rhetoric of pain or oppression at all times? Can it be a rhetoric of self-assertion, travel, fun? So for example, with Dosebai Kovas Jijasavala, the very fact that at the age of 28, she just happens to go on a trip with like 30 relatives from Bombay to Pune, and after that, there's no stopping her. She's just bitten by the wanderlust. She's just, that to me, the fact that she's like, I'll go, and she have to take a chaperone, right? And she's like, I'll take anybody. Like relatives I don't like. She's got like one at some point there's an, for all purposes we can say there's senility involved, there's an aged relative, whoever she can take. To me, those choices we are making, right? I'm reading all of that in that register. So to my mind, it doesn't have to be just this one thing of going forward or backward or what does someone else say or not say, but I think we have to locate it in the many, many different ways in which we seek to express ourselves, right? And that's what I found helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we've run out of time. I am so sorry. Yeah. It's just two eyes staring at me now. Thank you so much for your time, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Dia. That was lovely. Thank you, Anita.